Thank you very much, Ashish, and thanks to you all, to everyone. The issue about China in Africa is one that, it brings forth a lot of emotion, perspectives, etc. And what I want to do today is set the stage for a conversation. I'm going to be brief. I know people who start saying I'm going to be brief end up going on for a while, but I'm intentionally going to be brief because I want to leave some gaps. I want to be able to respond to your questions specifically about China and Africa. But before I start, I'd just like to ask us to, approach the issue with an open mind. We all have narratives when it comes to China. China gives money to dictators, no strings attached. We do the right thing. Not entirely true. Ethiopia is a case in point, and there are many others. So as we go through this conversation and also my colleague's conversation, there's one word I'd like to have us permeate the conversation, and the word is interests. Countries' interests, both the giving and the receiving countries, are what define this space of external partners and their relationships. So, generally, a lot of the conversation, doesn't have many facts and figures. I know there are lots of areas to discuss when it comes to China and Africa. Human rights, the economy, trade, finance, etc. But I want us to keep this particular conversation focused on the security sector and security implications. But before we do so, just wanted to put some facts that you may not be familiar with. The US provides in 2014, and I checked, I didn't see the 2015, but I think the trend is continuing. The US provides more foreign direct assistance the US provided more foreign assistance to African countries in 2014 than did China. The US is number one in new money going to African countries. China is number 7. The reason I put this here is not to, just throw out, uncoordinated facts at you, but you may not know this. And a lot of our narrative when it comes to China and Africa is usually at least 10 years dated. Things are changing. And the second narrative is China is there to get all the raw materials. That is true. But even that relationship has changed. Because if you look over the last 8 years, the nature of Chinese entrance into new markets in Africa has changed. Initially, they used to go in sole source, have the sweetheart deals, etc. But over the last 8 years, they're now going in as part of consortia. And this is not just because China discovered we need partners when we're going in to invest. It is because, particularly in the oil and gas sector, a lot of the new quote-unquote finds, or the now commercially viable finds, are in difficult places to extract. China doesn't have the technology. So they're now increasingly part of consortia, and that is forcing, a change of behavior in terms of practice and procedures. It's actually forced China to sign up to the EITI, which it has steadfastly refused to do for many years. And so the landscape is changing. And the risk calculus is also a little bit more acute as profit margins are slimming and the downturn in commodity prices across the world. And so China is becoming a little bit more strategic and a lot less, jumping in the whole hog. So point of the first slide is that understanding China and Africa, we have to understand China and Africa today, not what the textbook said 15, 20 years ago. This is a very interesting book. It's quite long, It's about 2.5 inches thick, I measured. And it kind of has a really interesting story, a historical analysis of China's foreign policy, of China versus the West. It's called Why the West Rules for Now. There's a lot in the book conceptually that I don't agree with, but what I find fascinating in the book is how they look through a number of strategic junctures in China's economic history to understand why China does things the way it does things. There's been a lot of criticism about the type of contracts that China has signed with African countries. And a lot of that is historical, because that's how China got their first bump in the 70s, resource-based contracts that it signed with Japan. And so understanding the method to the madness not only makes you smarter as you understand it, but helps you understand what leverage we could and should have as we think through how what we do in this space could make a lot of difference. Okay, so now let's look at what policy underlies China in Africa. And what I try to do here is compare the United States policy and the Chinese white paper on Africa. Ours relates to strengthening institutions, spurring growth, trade and investment, advancing peace and security, and promoting opportunity and development. That's more the social side. What does China bring to the table? This is a Chinese white paper. Getting them to do this white paper was like pulling teeth. It was very difficult to get them to finally, articulate what they plan to do. But as you can see, it's pretty vague and a little contradictory, because any relationship between a juggernaut like China and an African country is asymmetrical to begin with. So the issues about mutual benefit, reciprocity are just a priori non-starters. But why does it read like this? China has had something called the 5 principles since the end of the Second World War. And these 5 principles define how China interacts with the outside world, mainly. And so in understanding China, I would rather we start with what they decide to tell us, and we analyze it and see if it makes sense in today's African context.
Sorry, who got them to do that? You said that it took some doing to get them to write that white paper. Who got them to do that? Well,
it's international public opinion, diplomacy. They were shamed at I've forgotten the 2005 meeting of external assistants, and said, well, everybody has a paper except you guys, and so they finally released this quite hurriedly, but something. There's something called the Forum on Chinese African Cooperation, FOCAC for short. The first was in first it was in 2000. I think they had 2 more, and then they had one in 2015. What I'm trying to do with this chart is to highlight the evolution of China's approach to Africa. And first thing I noticed, looking at the 2000 and 2015, is that 2015 is a little bigger, more expanded. They're now explaining things a bit more. They're now, expanding it a little bit more than we are here to help you because we are your friends, to we have interests too, and by the way, this is what we are looking at. The guiding principles in 2000, and I'll ask you to Google the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. They first appeared shortly after the Second World War. They didn't use the 5 principles in 2015, which was curious to me. They now have 5 pillars which I'll talk about in the next slide. In 2000, as I said, it was hurried. It was just, okay, we're here to help you, we're your friends, and you don't get it now, we won't get in yours. And now it's a little bit more nuanced. And for the first time in all the FOCACs, they actually mentioned international targets like the SDG. They also mentioned a lot more things. They also included economic development and economic development type issues in this. 2015, they were a little bit more explicit about what they want diplomatically. They kind of really laid it out, the One China policy and reform of the Security Council. It's in FOCAC 2015. And we can go on. The bottom line is China is learning the hard way and is evolving. So if our thinking of China in Africa is still stuck in the FOCAC 2000, you know, we are going to be of very, very limited assistance to our African colleagues when we discuss or when we postulate. So, what was 2015 all about? And this is, you know, how they themselves described it. 1 upgrade, 5 pillars, and 10 plans over 3 years. Committed a significant amount of resources to a lot of things. But you would see the 5 pillars look a little bit like the 5 principles, but they're a bit more focused. They're now focused on what China thinks they'll get back and what they believe African countries should provide for them. The 10 pillars, as you could see, are a wide basket of sectors. It's no more just foreign policy, international relations. They're talking specifically about industrialization, specifically about finance, specifically about debt. And they're like a lot more detailed than I anticipated. This points to 2 things. One, they're beginning to understand contemporary Africa a lot better. And secondly, their calculus for the long game is changing. They recognize that in the old days when it was all about how does China graft into the new patrimonial network and perpetuate its, you know, relationship for many years, to significantly what does China need to invest in today that will bear fruit X number of years down the line. But let me just mention interests again, and this asymmetrical relationship that exists between African countries and China. There's a country that signed a mineral ore contract with a Chinese company, and part of that contract stipulated that if the world price for that particular commodity falls below a magic number, which is in the contract, the country would reimburse the Chinese company the extent of the shortfall in land, agriculture, and trade. And this was signed by the government and the head of a Chinese company. Why do I mention it here? I mention it here because when you roll out the impacts or implications of this asymmetrical relationship, we see that in many cases, no, let me go back a little bit. You ask yourself, why would a country do that? And in fact, I asked the minister of this country two questions when I met him. I said, first, does your country set the world price for this commodity? He said, no. I said, so why are you bearing risk unilaterally when you have an investor? And it's really easy to look and say, what a dumb set of folk, or he was just corrupt, he was bribed, etc. No, that's partly possibly true. But I think the bigger question here is that when China enters these commercial relationships with countries, it's part of what a lot of researchers and scholars have called the package deal. So that particular contract was linked with arms sales, which may have been linked with training for doctors. So if you lose one, you lose them all. And there's a short paper that I did many years ago that kind of explains how this package deal works. And it's not just in Africa. Remember, I used to work on copper mining in Afghanistan, and the copper bidding for the INAC copper mines in Afghanistan. Same thing. Chinese company won. Everyone thought that the top bid for that particular mine should be about 1.2, 1.3 billion. The Chinese company, the Meteorological Corporation of China, bid 2.1 billion. The Canadian and company and the other consortia, they lost out. And it went through international bidding processes, etc. But subsequently, a few people did some research. And at the time of the signing of that contract, the total assets, not the net assets, total assets of that company was less than 1 billion. So where did the extra billion, 0.1 come from? Was basically Chinese development assistance that had been written into the contract. That happens across Africa quite a bit. And so, as the change from 2000 to 2015, not just in FOCAC, but also in the way China calibrates its relationships, should give us pause for thought. So if a lot of what we are doing and saying, just, we're in 2000, bad guys, do things right, corrupt country, sign the right contract, and we don't understand how it is all connected and linked, it becomes problematic. So, FOCAC, etc., China has been promising and promising. We're really not sure exactly how they're going to afford all the promises, but that's a story for another day. But what I put up in these charts is some of the new areas that China seems to be going into. It's looking at support to the AU for rapid response. It's looking at supporting peacekeeping police forces. It's looking at heavy lift, etc. All the things that we are interested in. There's also been significant new money pledged. And again, we're still trying to calculate how new this new money is, but there's a lot of new money pledged. What does all of this mean? It means that the space that we occupy as external partners to African countries is getting smaller. Not just because of the volume of Chinese assistance and trade, but also because it's becoming a lot more diversified. Sectors that we didn't have to worry about in the past, we're now seeing China wanting to play a more active role. And I think that those are questions that we should grapple with. And not just in terms of what the analysis tells us or what the implications are, but how could we be more helpful to our African colleagues, not just in understanding this, but in just getting a sense of what strategy tells us. In this slide, I just try to compare the East and the West, mainly from an African perspective. Generally, I think for me there are two takeaways from this slide. One is that we, the United States, the quote-unquote West in general, we can do a lot with China, but if our processes are not A, expedited, and B, better aligned to domestic priorities, we'll be still behaving like China in some ways. And we have to, because it takes forever for us to make a decision, and forever and ever for us to start implementing. And in that time, China has gone forth and done, whatever. And in a sense, it's not just like, oh, the African countries like China. It is, I've been waiting for this road. The American counterpart says, yes, we will build a road for you, but we have to vet this, we have to vet that, we have to do this, we have procedures, we have processes. The rainy seasons come again, and China said, well, in three months, you can get that road. And in many cases, that is how it happens. So that's the first takeaway from this. We need to expedite. But the second takeaway is there's room for many players around the table. There are some things China does well. And there's some areas in which the United States is not competitive. One is infrastructure. It's very, very, very difficult to compete with China internationally. And let's put all corruption, etc. aside. They just have a model that, with minimal labor and material cost of materials, they'll outbid you. About 8 years ago, I attended a conference in New York, and it was one of these high-tech conferences with a lot of captains of industry worldwide and financiers. And what I found fascinating was that they tried to do it interactive. So the tables in all the 6 discussion groups were like multimedia marvels. And I was saying, this is great. And he says, oh no, these were customized, custom made just for this session, because everything had places for iPads and Wi-Fi and all this stuff. And I said, where do you get it from? Oh, he said the Chinese built it. Because when they bid for those 7 tables in New York, the cheapest bid that they got for that, I think, from the most competitive American company, was a little over $500,000 a pop, $600,000 a pop, and they were about to jettison the idea, and somebody said, "Open it to the Chinese." The Chinese came, saw the specs, constructed the exact same thing, flew in labor to assemble it in New York, and it came in at about $200K a pop. So that's the same thing that's happening in Africa. It's competitive. There are some areas in which are competitive. The second takeaway is areas in which they're competitive, have them do it, but help the countries to have structures that provide a sort of oversight and quality assurance that they need. And the other areas that they're not in, we could occupy and others could occupy. But then the trick becomes, how do you ensure that it's all connected and coordinated? That for me is the big challenge. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Thank you.